take care of our wife.
Mom, where am I? Rick?
Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. This will be my full Rick and Morty Season 7, Episode 10 video. There's a whole bunch of Easter eggs and references, so we'll break it all down. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the episodes. They said that they're actually in the middle of writing Season 9 right now. Like, they haven't completely finished that yet. They're still working on it, but the show's been renewed through Season 10, so we know they'll at least do 10 seasons. And as far as I know, as far as they've revealed, Season 8 will also be released, or at least part of it, hopefully, will be released by the end of 2024. But this episode is mostly about Morty confronting his fear that he really does need Rick in a way that he never really acknowledged before, because previously on the show, there's this whole idea that Rick always needed Morty, like they dealt with it from Rick's side of things in previous seasons. One of the big tropes of the show is also Morty trying to high road Rick, but then bungling things in some huge way and making problems even worse. But the whole idea is that he's always challenged Rick's morality and made it seem like he'll leave Rick at any turn. Even Dan Harmon said that the theoretical ending of the show would be Morty literally just turning 15 years old and not needing to go on adventures or not wanting to go on adventures with Rick anymore because he just found other interests. Like, the whole idea is that the show works because Morty is still 14 years old, even though they have that montage at the end, but they reveal that Morty's still in the hole, so it's not real. But a lot of that was a reference to the theoretical future of these characters, like you see Rick trying to make himself younger, and it seemed like they had not been going on adventures as Morty had gotten old, gotten a job, bought his own house, and basically turned into a version of his father. So I think the idea is that after Morty went to college, he did not go on adventures with Rick anymore, even though they got drunk together a couple of times. So if you ever wondered what like the very ending of Rick and Morty is going to be, it's literally probably just going to be what Dan Harmon said, Morty turning 15 years old. You could also say that the episode is about Dan Harmon and the writers in real life facing their fears over Rick and Morty, the show, turning into crap if it were to run too long. Like they say later in the episode, a thing can be great or it can last forever. It can't be both things. So a big part of the episode is Dan Harmon and the writers coming to terms with that. The actual episode title was Fear No Mort, which is a reference to the movie Fear No More, obviously big fear theme, all about Morty facing his fears. The episode is also unique in that there's no cold open like usual. Like sometimes we'll have episodes that will skip the opening titles like we did earlier this season. This time it was the opposite of that. They skipped the cold open and just start with the titles. They reveal a couple scenes in the intro did not happen this season, like a couple scenes seemed like they were fake, but one of the longest running theories in the fandom, and I think that Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon have both said this on previous occasions, is that scenes that you don't see in the intro in actual episodes, theoretically they would pay off in future seasons at some point, so they're just scenes that have not happened yet. During the actual opening scene, Rick and Morty travel to a carnival of nightmares, which Morty says that they're not afraid of anymore, like it used to be scary, implying that they've gone to the carnival on previous occasions, and they've also just become desensitized in general, which Morty also referenced in last week's episode, saying that's why he wouldn't kill Rick anymore, because he failed a morality test at school so hard that they called Homeland Security on him, like it messed him up so bad. The actual bit with the Carnival of Nightmares is a reference to the Ray Bradbury story, which they also turned into a movie called Something Wicked This Way Comes. During that story, a diabolical carnival comes to town run by a Mr. Dark who's a demon living off the life force of people that he preys upon inside his carnival, entrapping them by making it seem like he can grant their any wish, which is basically the whole trope with this character here in the fear hole that will just show people anything that they're afraid of, while feeding off of their fear.
If anything, he seems pretty brave. Certainly not afraid to die. Maybe that makes his fear extra delicious.
If you couldn't tell, the carnival owner is played by Liev Schreiber, who's like the celebrity guest cameo this week. He also claims he originally came from Earth, implying that he is some sort of celestial being now, like he's some sort of ancient creature. There are a couple of jokes about this later in the episode when Morty gets into the weeds and starts questioning the logic of it, like, are you part of the whole? Like, are you connected to the whole in some way?
So what are you? Like the hole? The hole's promoter? The hole's intern?
Is there a hole here?
He claims the scariest thing in existence is a fear hole that exists inside a toilet stall of a Denny's restaurant, which feels kind of like a riff on the Shoney's joke from earlier seasons, like we've never left the Shoney's. The whole bit with the old school CRT and the tape that you play in the VCR about the instructions feels like a reference to the Ring movies too, like where you play the tape. When they actually play it though, the font here is from classic 80s TV shows, like it's a trope of 80s TV shows, but they make the Gaddafi reference with the Mountain Dew ad, making it seem like this was from the late 70s or the early 80s at some point. Also, the Something Wicked This Way Comes movie was from 1983. The actual Ray Bradbury book that it's based on, though, is from the 1960s. If you're not familiar with who Gaddafi was, he was a dictator that ruled Libya till he was killed in the 2010s. And basically the way the hole works is it's like a living entity that consumes the fear given off of people when it shows them their greatest fears, and they have this honor board with Polaroids next to it for everyone who's successfully conquered their fears. Later at the end of the episode, Rick also explains it's a one-person only kind of use ride. Like the hole can only process the fears of one person at any given time. They also reveal that the hole itself is not bottomless. Even if Morty didn't have Rick's help, he could still crawl out pretty easily on his own. Notice that Rick calls Morty a little turd as he literally jumps in the hole, so it's kind of like Morty is being a metaphorical giant turd flushing himself down a toilet. In the way they play the episode, they want you to question whose fear they're actually facing, like is Rick down here facing his fears, or is it all about Morty facing his fears? They do reveal at the end of the episode, like I said, though, it was always Morty the whole time, so Rick was always fake during all these scenes. Then they play that same bit from the M. Night Shyamalan Aliens episode in season 1, where Morty thinks that they conquered their fears and escaped the hole, like they take a picture together and they go back home, but they're still inside the hole, like we're in a simulation inside another simulation, like we never left the actual hole. But remember, Morty's always been there himself, like he doesn't realize that Rick was fake this whole time till the very end of the episode. They wind up taking that bit to its logical conclusion too, like the whole idea that Morty just keeps finding himself in the hole, like what if we never left the hole? And it winds up turning into a time dilation Roy game situation, like he winds up living out his entire life into middle age, but reveals that he's still inside the hole and he's only been a couple minutes. But when they go back home the first time, the family's watching interdimensional cable, notices they're watching that same TV show from earlier this season that Rick was watching, Is It Cake? Wondering whether or not a person is actually cake, like a sentient cake that just looks like a human. Part of the whole joke there is that the cakes will like scream out in terror, and like sometimes the contestants will get it wrong and wind up slicing through an actual person. Then they start the whole bit with Rick's wife coming back, and obviously this is still Morty's fear being manifested, like his need for Rick. Like, what if Rick were happy? He wouldn't need me anymore. At least within the context of the scenario, the way they explain it is that this Diane is from another timeline where her Rick was able to save her, but he died in the process. That's why in her timeline, her version of Lost ended in a different way. Like hers only lasted for one season, but the ending for the Lost TV show in the universe that Rick originally came from is basically the ending from the real life version of the show, where they all ended up in the church and they were dead the whole time. But part of the idea is that this version of Rick's wife is from the moment that she would have originally died, so she doesn't know anything about what happened to Rick after she did die. And even though they kind of get into the weeds about them arguing with each other about whose fear is being faced and what needs to be conquered in order for them to get out of the actual hole, Rick here, even though he's the fake version of Rick, calls out the real fear, Rick not needing Morty anymore if he were to ever gain happiness by getting his wife back.
Your greatest fear is me getting Diane back and being happy again.
Maybe you could think of that as the show clowning on Morty for being kind of dumb and not figuring things out quite fast enough, which they do later in the episode with this TV show version of Mr. Dark, or the parody on Mr. Dark, who kind of calls Morty dumb to his face, like you're too dumb to actually figure out what's really going on. Also the idea that Morty is just a little too dumb to really be afraid, like the smarter you are, the more afraid you are. So just to be clear, even though a big part of the episode is this fake version of Rick who's still inside the hole trying to think about facing his own fears, like maybe I'm afraid of losing Diane, like they do it from his perspective in the episode. Remember, it's meant to have been a fake version of Rick this whole time, and Morty is just manifesting all this himself. When they're actually catching up over ice cream, though, his wife references a lot of long-running tropes that the series has with Beth, notably time travel and how much the show has tried to avoid it, not always successfully, though. Like, we've actually had a couple time travel episodes in the run of the show. When his wife starts talking about Rick developing teleportation before she was supposed to have died, if it wasn't clear, after the Rick Prime ending earlier this season, the writers came out and said that C137 Rick and Rick Prime were meant to be the two Ricks who created portal technology, portal guns, first, and every other Rick in existence got the technology from one of them. And even though this version of Rick was meant to be fake the whole time, obviously this version of Diane faked the whole time too, just because part of Morty's greater simulation that he was running, I think all the backstory that they fill in for her character is meant to be accurate. So part of the idea here is that she's meant to be really smart, like not quite as smart as Rick. She seems like she gets up to speed pretty quickly, like she understands the concept of these other realities. Like, this isn't technically my version of Beth, you're not my real husband because my husband died. That's because she technically came from another timeline. Rick also breaks the fourth wall again here when he says everyone except for him and Morty are basically like NPCs, so their side quests don't matter. It also kind of works within the context of this episode too, because they're all NPCs except for Morty because he's the only person in the hole. But in a more meta way, it's all about the idea that the show is really about Rick and Morty. That's why the show is called Rick and Morty, so any of the other family members' adventures don't really matter that much for the plot. When he says Beth could theoretically only be a version of her daughter who's a clone of her, that's another callback to all the times he's jumped to different realities, so like she's many times removed from being the original version of Beth, and it's a reference to Clone Beth because he cloned both of them and doesn't know who the real one is. When they go home, again, Rick starts calling out more rom-com storytelling tropes. That's a big thing during episodes, is him calling out storytelling tropes just in general. He references You Got Mail, but then also reveals that he never actually watched the movie, so the plot that he explains with Tom Hanks killing the cop at the beginning of the movie is totally wrong, because he never actually watched it. And one of the weird things, though, they try to trick you with in the episode is the perspectives that they take in the episode. Like, you see Diane waking up inside Jerry's office on her own, even though theoretically the only actual person in the hole was Morty this whole time. Like, why would they show you someone else's perspective in the episode? It was mostly just part of the show trying to play a trick on you and fool you into thinking who was real and who was not real in the episode. But all the bits here with them talking about their backstory together, meeting each other for the first time, I think that's meant to be true, though. Rick creates the robot to apologize to her with waffles instead of just apologizing himself. She recognizes the arms because it's from an adventure where they met each other when he was building a robot for the FBI, where it sounds like she was working at, and that's how he met her. And I think they're implying here, because the robot is like, why do I have memories of being a human child, is that Rick, at least in this scenario, even though it's a fake version of Rick, created a robot using the mental patterns or like the brain patterns from a child that died. So the robot still thinks that it's a human child. When they go to the zoo and Summer's telling her story about becoming queen of a civilization that Rick helped create from a zit on her face, that's not from an actual episode that they've done, but Summer has been queen in previous episodes like Primordius, but that was from like a completely separate adventure. They reveal that Diane's master's thesis when she was still in school was trying to discover what ducks were actually saying to each other. Rick created a way to translate their speech, but the joke is that they're just super foul-mouthed. They just wind up dropping F-bombs at each other, eating bread. They have a whole bit about them going to an alien bar and trying to drink each other under the table. One of the other aliens getting alcohol poisoning, and I think they're just trying to reveal that Diane's personality is a lot like Rick's personality, and that's kind of what drew them together in the first place. They really want you to think that Rick is real in this simulation, though, like trying to let go or not wanting to let go of Diane. But remember, he's meant to be fake this whole time. This is all just a manifestation of Morty's fears. So the whole bit with Morty looking great and questioning why Rick looks so bad is just the whole trying to fool him. When Rick says they're going to Showbiz Pizza Place, like he gets dressed up and goes with Diane, that was an actual restaurant in the United States. I actually went to it when I was a child before it actually closed down. The best way I could describe it is that the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise is kind of based on that whole conceit, like the animatronic animals that actually sing and dance. There are a couple surprises too. They reveal that Morty's bike actually functions like a personal aircraft that he can fly to the Denny's, where he confronts the Mr. Dark owner, claiming that Rick is actually terrified of happiness. But like I said, this is all just part of Morty's greater fear manifestation. He's still in the hole is still working its magic on him. He goes through a much bigger montage trying to face a bunch of different fears, not quite sure exactly what it is that he has to do. They start with a bunch of fears about Jessica. He reveals a bunch of the things that he likes about her. The one about her name meaning foresight, I think, is also meant to be a callback to her becoming a time god. He fails the trust fall, then he tries to fail at the play. I already explained the whole bit with Rick and Diane explaining the respective endings to the Lost TV show. The ending that Rick explains is the one from actual real life. Like if you watch the Lost TV show, that was the way the show ended. In the timeline that Diane came from, though, the show only lasted for one season, and it's meant to be this metaphor where the show is kind of calling itself out. Like the writers are making fun of the Rick and Morty show itself, saying that you can either last for a little while and be great, or you can be around forever. And in reality, the writers and Dan Harmon have said that Rick and Morty could become kind of like the new version of The Simpsons, a show that just stays on forever. So it's like the writers, Dan Harmon, are making fun of themselves for keeping the show on forever. Then remember, even though they do this whole bit about Rick trying to sacrifice himself and leave Diane for Morty's benefit to save him, it's still coming from Morty's larger fears. It's still just Morty in the hole, so this version of Rick was never real. They wind up trying to fail the play by getting naked and rapping, which is a bit of a callback to Get Swifty. They also kind of did that in a recent episode where they did a literal sequel to the Get Swifty episode, basically rapping their way out of a problem. Even though in this context, it doesn't work, like they're still inside the hole, even after it seems like they get out of the hole. And they basically take the whole "we're still inside the hole, like we never left the Shoney's" bit to its logical conclusion, like they just keep going and going and going. And like I said, it turns into a Roy game kind of bit, time dilation, where he winds up living his entire life, but is still inside the hole. They reveal one of Rick's fears, or at least Morty imagining one of Rick's fears, is paying $8 for a tiny bit of bacon. Rick breaks the fourth wall again when he references them still climbing out of the hole 2 seasons from now, which would be season 9. We go through that kind of Roy similar type of scenario where Morty grows up over time. Like he goes to college, they drop him off, Space Beth is still there, he graduates from college, he gets much, much older, he moves out of home into his own house, gets drunk with Rick. I believe the tow moving truck was also featured earlier on the show. Summer gets married, Morty gets into trouble at his job. And some of you probably noticed this, but when he realizes in the mirror that he looks just like Jerry, like, oh, I've turned into my father, that should have been a clue that he's still inside the hole because we've seen older Morty and he didn't look anything like Jerry. Then Morty finally realizes that it was all about his true fear that Rick won't need him if he ever became happy, which is a reference back to earlier in the episode when the fake version of Rick in the hole basically said that exact same thing. The idea that Rick doesn't actually need Morty and never jumped in after him in the first place. And even though we do know that Rick actually does care about Morty, they kind of logically explain it later when Rick says, oh, it's only a one-person only kind of use thing. I couldn't have jumped in after you even if I wanted to. So it's sort of a way to have their cake and eat it too. Like he still cares about Morty, but also he wasn't going to jump in to save him. When he asked Morty to define irreplaceable, that's actually a callback to the replacement Mortys at the Citadel of Ricks, which they used to do all the time. Like, here's your ticket for one free replacement Morty before the Citadel was blown up. Then the whole idea with Rick going back to the hole and hanging up the Polaroid of Morty is just meant to show you that Morty did conquer his fears. Like, this is meant to be a real ending, even though you're kind of wondering because they went through it so many times. Like, are we still inside the hole? Are we still inside the hole? Like, no, it's meant to be real this time. It's just Morty because it was only ever just Morty inside the hole. Then they bring back a long-running tradition now with having a Mr. Poopy Butthole post-credit scene for the endings of seasons. This time they reveal since the last time we saw him, he's stolen one of Rick's portal guns and used it to take the life of another version of himself from another reality, but making it seem like that other version's wife is on to him, knowing that he's a fake and plans to kill him eventually. I think that's just meant to be a callback to in Morty's fear simulation, he was worried about Rick learning the wrong lessons from the whole scenario, whereas here, Mr. Poopy Butthole definitely doesn't learn from his previous misdeeds in earlier episodes and is probably going to wind up getting him killed. R.I.P. to Mr. Poopy Butthole. There are a whole bunch of Easter eggs and references in the episode, so if you spotted any that I didn't talk about during the video, just write them below in the comments. Like I said, Season 8 should premiere around the same time that Season 7 premiered at the end of 2024. They also just revealed there's a brand new Rick and Morty anime that's going to premiere at some point next year. They just released a teaser for that, but that's not meant to be canon to the actual series. It's just like a completely separate project that they have people working on. If you haven't watched any of those Rick and Morty anime episodes, they're super trippy, super weird. There's a bunch of big stuff coming up though. My episodes for What If Season 2 will start posting later this week. Click here for the trailer for that, and click here for all my other Rick and Morty episodes. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.